The scream tore through the great hall before anyone could stop it, and every wolf inside froze where they stood. Ilara Voss stood in the center of the hall, her hands shaking, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain the entire pack could hear it. In front of her, standing tall on the raised platform, was Cale Ashbourne, the Alpha King, the man the moon itself had chosen for her, and he was about to destroy her in front of everyone she had ever known. "Cale," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her own pulse. "Please, don't do this." He did not look at her. His jaw was tight, his eyes fixed on some point above her head, as if looking directly at her would break whatever resolve he had built inside himself. The torches along the stone walls flickered, throwing long shadows across the crowd of pack members who had gathered to witness what was supposed to be a celebration. Instead, they were about to witness a tragedy. "Ilara Voss," Cale said, and his voice, usually warm when he spoke to her in private, was cold and formal, the voice of a king addressing a subject rather than a man addressing his mate. "I reject you." The words landed like a blow. A collective gasp rippled through the hall. Somewhere near the back, a child began to cry, sensing the wrongness in the air before understanding the words themselves. Ilara felt the bond between them snap. It was not a metaphor. It was real, a physical sensation, like a cord being cut deep inside her chest. She staggered back a step, pressing a hand to her ribs, as if she could hold the pieces of herself together. The pain was unlike anything she had ever known, sharper than any wound, deeper than any grief. She had heard stories of rejection, had heard the older wolves speak of it in hushed voices around the fire, but she had never imagined it would feel like dying while still being forced to stand upright. "Why?" The word slipped out of her before she could stop it, small and broken, nothing like the voice of the woman she had been an hour ago. Cale's throat moved as he swallowed. For one moment, just one, something flickered across his face. Regret, perhaps, or grief, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared, smoothed over by the mask of authority he had worn since the day he became Alpha King. "The alliance with the Drake Pack requires a mate of equal standing," he said, and his voice did not waver even though his hands, held stiffly at his sides, curled into fists. "Seraphina Drake will be crowned Luna in your place. This is what is best for the kingdom. Best for the kingdom, not best for her, not best for them. Just for the kingdom, as if she were a tax to be paid, a debt to be settled, a burden to be lifted so the true business of ruling could continue unhindered." Ilara looked past him, to where Seraphina Drake stood near the edge of the platform, dressed in fine silver silk, her expression carefully neutral. She did not look triumphant. If anything, she looked uncomfortable, as though she too understood the weight of what was happening, and wished she were anywhere else. But discomfort did not stop her from staying exactly where she was. The pack elders murmured among themselves, and Ilara caught fragments of their whispers. Some sounded sympathetic. Others sounded relieved, as if they had been waiting for this moment, waiting for the fated mate bond to be broken so that politics could take its natural course. She had never realized how many people in this pack saw her as an obstacle, rather than a future queen. "You don't mean this," she said, taking a step toward the platform. Two guards shifted forward, ready to block her path if she came any closer, but she stopped on her own. She would not be dragged away like a prisoner. She still had that much pride left, even as everything else crumbled inside her. "Cale, look at me. Look at me and tell me you don't feel this too." For a moment, he did look at her, his golden eyes, the eyes she had fallen for the very first night the moon had pulled them together in the forest clearing, met hers, and she saw the truth there, before he buried it again. He did feel it. The bond was screaming inside him, just as it was screaming inside her. But he was choosing to ignore it, choosing duty over the mate the universe had given him, and that choice was somehow more painful than the rejection itself. "It is done," Cale said, turning away from her at last. "Take her belongings from the eastern quarters. She is no longer welcome within the packlands." The words fell over her like ice water. No longer welcome. Not just rejected as a mate, but exiled as a member of the only family she had ever known. Her parents had died when she was young, killed in a border skirmish with a rival pack, and the Crimson Moon Pack had raised her, fed her, trained her, given her a home. Now that home was being taken from her in the same breath as her mate. She looked around the hall one last time, searching the faces of people she had grown up beside, hoping to find even one who would speak up, one who would say this was wrong. But no one moved. No one spoke. Fear of the Alpha King's authority, or perhaps simple self-interest, kept every mouth shut and every head bowed. Alara straightened her spine. She would not cry in front of these people. She would not give Cale Ashbourne the satisfaction of watching her fall apart. Whatever was left of her heart, she would carry it out of this hall herself, on her own 2 feet, without anyone's help. "Then I will go," she said, and her voice, though quiet, carried clearly through the silent hall. "But you should know something, Cale. A king who breaks his own bond to serve his throne will one day find that the throne cannot love him back." She turned and walked toward the great doors at the end of the hall, her steps steady, even though her legs felt like they belonged to someone else. Behind her, she heard Seraphina's soft, uncertain voice ask Cale something, and she heard him answer in clipped, short words, already moving forward with the business of his new arrangement, as though nothing had happened at all. Outside, the night air was cold and sharp, and the moon hung low and heavy above the tree line, full and bright, mocking her with its light. The same moon that had bound her to Cale 3 years ago now watched her walk away from him, and she could have sworn, for just a moment, that it dimmed in sympathy. She did not go back to the eastern quarters to collect her things. There was nothing there she needed. A few dresses, a hairbrush, a small carved wooden wolf her father had given her before he died. None of it mattered anymore. Objects could be replaced. What had been taken from her tonight could not. She walked past the training grounds where she had learned to fight, past the stables where she used to sit for hours, simply listening to the horses breathe, past the small garden where she had shared her first real conversation with Cale, back when he was still just a young warrior, and not yet an Alpha King burdened with the weight of an entire kingdom. Every step took her further from the only life she had known, and every step hurt less than the one before it, not because the pain was fading, but because she was going numb. At the edge of the pack territory, marked by an old stone boundary post worn smooth by centuries of weather, she paused. Behind her lay everything familiar. Ahead of her lay nothing but dark forest and uncertainty. She thought about turning back, about begging one more time, about falling to her knees in front of Cale and pleading for him to reconsider. The thought lasted only a second before she crushed it entirely. She had already lost her mate. She would not also lose her dignity. "Alara." The voice came from behind her, and she turned, startled, to find Grace Whitmore standing a short distance away. Grace had been her closest friend since childhood, one of the few people in the pack who had never treated Alara differently for being an orphan. Grace's eyes were red-rimmed, as if she had been crying, and she held something wrapped in cloth against her chest. "You shouldn't be here," Alara said, glancing back toward the packlands. "If anyone sees you—" "I don't care what anyone sees," Grace said fiercely, closing the distance between them. She pressed the cloth bundle into Alara's hands. Inside was a small pouch of coins, a warm cloak, and a hunting knife with a worn leather handle. "You'll need these. Please, take them." Alara's throat tightened, and for the first time since the rejection, she felt tears threaten to spill. "Grace, I can't." "You can and you will," Grace said, gripping her friend's hands tightly. "What Cale did tonight was wrong. Everyone in that hall knew it, even if no one had the courage to say it. You are not weak for leaving, Alara. You are strong for surviving what he did to you." Alara pulled her friend into a tight embrace, holding on for a long moment, memorizing the feeling of one last kindness before she stepped into the unknown. "Thank you," she whispered. "For everything. For all of it." "Where will you go?" Grace asked, pulling back to look at her. "I don't know," Alara admitted. "Somewhere far. Somewhere no one has heard the name Alara Voss, and no one knows what it means to be rejected by an Alpha King." Grace's eyes filled with fresh tears, but she nodded, understanding that there was no argument that would change her friend's mind. "Then be safe. Promise me you'll be safe." "I promise," Alara said, though even as the words left her mouth, she wondered if it was a promise she could keep. The northern territories beyond the packlands were said to be filled with rogue wolves, wolves who had been cast out of their own packs for crimes or weakness, wolves who answered to no law and showed no mercy to strangers. It was a dangerous place for anyone to wander alone, let alone a newly rejected wolf whose bond had just been severed, leaving her physically and emotionally raw. But there was no other choice. She could not stay here, watching Kale build a life with another woman, watching Serafina wear the crown that should have been hers, watching the pack she loved slowly forget that she had ever existed. Better to face the unknown dangers of the wilderness than the certain agony of staying. Grace watched her walk away until the darkness of the forest swallowed her whole, and then, wiping her eyes, she turned back toward the packlands, carrying the secret of their meeting like a stone in her chest. Elara walked through the night without stopping, her wolf senses guiding her feet, even as her mind remained clouded with grief. She did not shift, not yet. Her wolf was too raw, too wounded by the broken bond, and she feared that if she let it take control, it might do something reckless, might turn back toward the packlands and attack the very people who had cast her out. Better to keep walking on two legs, slow and steady, until the rage and grief settled into something more manageable. By the time the sun began to rise, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that felt cruelly beautiful against her mood, Elara had crossed the boundary into the neutral territories, the wild lands that belonged to no pack, where the old laws did not apply, and survival depended entirely on one's own strength. She found a small cave tucked into a rocky hillside and collapsed inside it, finally allowing herself to feel the full weight of everything that had happened. She did not cry, not really. The tears came, but they felt distant, disconnected from the hollow ache in her chest. She simply lay there, staring at the rough stone ceiling, replaying the moment Kale had said those two terrible words, "I reject you." Over and over, the memory played, and each time it did, something inside her hardened just a little more, the softness of the girl who had loved him giving way to something tougher, something that understood it would need to be tough in order to survive what came next. She thought about her father, about the lessons he had taught her before he died, about strength and honor, and never letting anyone see you break. She thought about her mother's quiet resilience, about the way she had faced every hardship in life with a steady, unshaken calm. Elara had inherited both of their strengths, even if she had spent the last 3 years softened by love and comfort, and the promise of a future with Kale. That future was gone now, but the strength remained, buried deep, waiting to be called upon. As the days passed, Elara pushed further into the northern wilderness, surviving on what she could hunt and forage, sleeping in caves and hollowed trees, avoiding contact with other wolves whenever possible. She heard stories, whispered around campfires she observed from a distance, of a growing community of exiles and rogues gathering somewhere deep in the north, wolves who had been abandoned or cast out by their own packs, banding together for protection and survival. Part of her wanted to seek them out. Another part of her, the part still raw from betrayal, wanted nothing to do with other wolves at all. But survival has a way of making decisions for you. One evening, nearly 2 weeks after she had left the Crimson Moon Pack behind, Elara was ambushed by a pair of rogue wolves who had been tracking her for days, drawn by the scent of a lone, unclaimed female traveling without pack protection. She fought them off with everything she had, using the knife Grace had given her and every fighting technique she had ever learned, but she was exhausted, weakened by weeks of poor sleep and worse food, and she barely survived the encounter, stumbling away with wounds that would leave lasting scars. It was in the aftermath of that fight, bleeding and exhausted, leaning against a tree for support, that Elara made a decision. She would not survive as prey. She would not spend the rest of her life running and hiding, hoping no one noticed her, hoping no one exploited her weakness. If the wilderness demanded strength, then she would become the strongest thing in it. She would build something for herself, something that no Alpha King could ever take away, something that belonged to her and her alone. She did not know it yet, standing there in the dark forest with blood on her hands and fire in her heart, but that decision would change the course of her entire life. The girl who had been rejected by an Alpha King was about to become something far greater than a rejected mate. She was about to become a queen in her own right, forged not by birthright or bonding, but by survival, by will, and by the refusal to ever again let someone else decide her worth. Behind her, in the halls of the Crimson Moon Pack, Kale Ashbourne stood on the balcony of his chambers that same night, staring out at the same moon that watched over Elara's wounded body in the forest. He told himself he had made the right choice, the necessary choice, the choice that would keep his kingdom safe and strong. But sleep would not come to him, and deep in his chest, where the mate bond had once lived, there remained a hollow ache that no amount of political success could fill. He did not know it yet either, but the woman he had cast aside in that great hall would return to him one day, not as the broken girl he remembered, but as someone entirely different. And when that day came, he would have to face not only what he had done, but what he had truly lost. 3 months had passed since Alara Voss vanished into the northern wilderness, and in that time, the Crimson Moon Pack had done everything possible to erase her from its memory. Her name was rarely spoken, her old chambers had been cleared and repurposed. Even the training grounds where she had once sparred with the Pack's finest warriors now belonged, in everyone's mind, to a chapter of history that had quietly closed. Everyone except Cale Ashbourne. He stood at the head of the council table, listening to the reports from his advisors about the upcoming wedding preparations, but his mind was elsewhere. Beside him, Seraphina Drake sat with perfect posture, her hands folded neatly in her lap, nodding along to discussions about seating arrangements and treaty terms, as though she had been born for this exact role. In many ways, she had been. Seraphina was the daughter of Alpha Drake, raised from birth to understand politics, alliances, and the delicate balance of power between packs. She was intelligent, composed, and undeniably beautiful, with dark hair that fell in smooth waves and sharp green eyes that missed nothing. She would make an excellent Luna. Cale knew this. He had known it when he made the arrangement with her father months ago, long before the rejection ceremony, long before he stood in front of his entire pack and severed a bond that the moon itself had created. Seraphina was everything a king could want in a partner for ruling a kingdom. She was simply not the one his wolf wanted. Alpha King, one of the advisors said, drawing Cale's attention back to the present moment. The Drake Pack has requested that the wedding take place within the month, given the current tensions along the eastern border. They believe a formal alliance will discourage further aggression from the Thornwood Pack. Cale nodded, forcing himself to focus. Tell them the timeline is acceptable. We should move quickly to secure the alliance before tensions escalate further. Seraphina glanced at him, a small crease forming between her brows, though she said nothing. She had grown accustomed, in the months since her arrival, to Cale's distant moods, the way his gaze sometimes drifted toward the window during meetings, the way he sometimes flinched at unexpected sounds, as though listening for something that was no longer there. She did not know the details of what had happened between him and Alara Voss. The pack had been careful to keep the specifics quiet, presenting the rejection as a simple matter of political necessity, rather than the breaking of a fated bond. But Seraphina was not foolish. She sensed there was more to the story than anyone had told her. After the meeting concluded and the advisors filed out of the room, Seraphina remained seated, watching Cale as he stared out the window at the training grounds below. "You seem far away today," she said carefully. "Is something troubling you?" Cale turned to face her, schooling his expression into something more neutral. "Just matters of the border. Nothing you need to concern yourself with." Seraphina studied him for a long moment. She was not in love with Cale, not yet, and perhaps not ever, given the circumstances of their arrangement. But she respected him, and she had hoped, when she agreed to this marriage, that respect might eventually grow into something warmer. Lately, though, she had begun to wonder if there would always be a distance between them, a wall she could not quite identify the source of. "Cale," she said, her voice softer now, "I know this marriage was arranged for reasons that have nothing to do with affection. I am not naive about that. But if we are to rule together, to raise a family together, I would like to understand you, truly understand you. Is that too much to ask?" For a moment, Cale considered telling her everything, about the fated bond he had severed, about the girl he had grown up loving before duty forced his hand, about the ache that lived in his chest every single night, refusing to fade no matter how much time passed. But he could not bring himself to say the words. Speaking them aloud would make the loss real in a way he was not prepared to face. "It is not too much to ask," he said instead. "Give me time, Seraphina. I promise I will try to be a good partner to you." She nodded, accepting the answer even though it did not satisfy her, and rose from her chair to leave him alone with his thoughts. As the door closed behind her, Cale let out a long breath and pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. His wolf stirred restlessly beneath his skin, agitated and unhappy, as it had been every day since the rejection. He had expected the ache to fade with time. Instead, it seemed to grow sharper, as though some part of him understood that Ilara was still out there, alive, and the bond, though severed on the surface, had never truly disappeared. That night, unable to sleep, Kale left his chambers and walked the quiet corridors of the pack house alone. He found himself, without quite deciding to, standing in front of the door to what had once been Ilara's room. It was empty now, repurposed as storage for extra linens and furniture. But for a moment, standing there in the dim hallway, he could almost remember the sound of her laughter drifting from behind that door, the warmth of her presence filling the entire corridor. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was mostly bare, stacked with crates and folded fabric, but in the corner, half hidden behind an old wardrobe, he spotted something small and out of place. He crossed the room and knelt down, pulling out a small wooden carving of a wolf, worn smooth from years of handling. He recognized it immediately. Ilara had kept it on her windowsill for as long as he had known her, a gift from her father before he died. She had told him once that it was the only thing she had left of her parents. She had left it behind. In her rush to leave that night, or perhaps out of some deliberate choice to sever every connection to her old life, she had left behind the one object that had mattered most to her. Kale held the small carving in his hands, running his thumb over its worn edges, and felt something crack open inside his chest. He had told himself, over and over, that he had done the right thing, that duty demanded sacrifice, that a king could not always choose his heart over his kingdom. But holding this small wooden wolf, he understood, perhaps for the first time with real clarity, the size of what he had actually thrown away. He slipped the carving into his pocket and left the room, closing the door quietly behind him. Meanwhile, far to the north, Ilara Voss was building something entirely new. The wound from the rogue wolf attack had healed weeks ago, leaving faint scars along her forearm, that she now wore as a reminder rather than a source of shame. In the time since that night, she had found her way to a loose settlement of exiled wolves, living in the shadow of the northern mountains, wolves who had been cast out of their packs for reasons ranging from minor rule violations to accusations of weakness or failure. They lived in scattered shelters, distrustful of one another, surviving day to day with no real leadership or organization. Ilara had arrived among them as a stranger, wary and guarded, expecting to find the same cruelty she had encountered from the rogue wolves who attacked her. Instead, she found desperation. These were not monsters. They were wolves, who had been discarded by the same rigid systems that had discarded her. Wolves who had nowhere else to go, and no one willing to help them. She began, slowly and carefully, to help. At first, it was small things. She shared food she had hunted with a family who had gone 2 days without eating. She helped an injured wolf named Edmund set a broken leg using splints made from tree branches. She showed a group of younger exiles, barely more than pups, how to build proper shelters that would withstand the harsh northern winters. Word spread quickly through the scattered settlement about the newcomer who seemed to know how to survive, and more importantly, who seemed to actually care about the survival of others. Within a month, wolves began seeking her out for advice. Within 2 months, they began asking her to make decisions for the group, to settle disputes, to organize hunting parties and defensive patrols against the rogue wolves who still occasionally attacked isolated individuals. Ilara resisted the responsibility at first, unsure if she wanted to build anything resembling a pack again after what had happened to her. But watching these wolves suffer, watching children go hungry and elders go untreated for illness, she found she could not simply walk away. "You could lead us," Edmund told her one evening, sitting by the fire she had built at the center of the growing settlement. His leg had healed well under her care, and he had become one of her most loyal supporters in the weeks since. "Everyone here already looks to you. Why not make it official?" "I'm not interested in being an alpha," Ilara said, though even as she spoke the words, she felt the shape of a different truth forming inside her. "I just want to survive. I want everyone here to survive." "Sometimes those are the same thing," Edmund replied. "A leader who wants nothing but survival for her people is exactly the kind of leader this place needs." Ilara said nothing, staring into the flames, thinking about the Crimson Moon Pack, about the rigid hierarchies and political marriages that had defined her old life, about the way even fated bonds could be discarded when they became inconvenient. If she built something here, it would not look like that. It would not be built on bloodlines or political convenience. It would be built on something sturdier, loyalty earned through actual care, strength proven through survival, not birthright. Over the following months, the loose settlement of exiles began to transform, under Ilara's quiet, steady guidance. She organized proper hunting rotations to ensure everyone had enough food. She established a system of shared shelter building so that no family went without protection from the elements. She trained anyone willing to learn basic combat skills, preparing the community to defend itself against rogue wolves and other threats. Slowly, without ever officially declaring herself anything, she became the person everyone turned to, the person who held the entire fragile community together. Word of the growing settlement began to spread beyond the northern wilderness. Other exiles, hearing rumors of a place where discarded wolves were welcomed, rather than hunted, began making the journey north, swelling the population of what had once been a scattered handful of desperate survivors into a genuine community numbering in the hundreds. It was Edmund who first started calling her the Wolf Queen, half in jest during a gathering one evening, but the name stuck, spreading through the settlement and eventually beyond it, carried by traveling wolves who spoke of the mysterious woman in the north, who had built a kingdom out of nothing but exiles and outcasts. Ilara did not correct the name when she heard it. Somewhere in the months since her rejection, the broken girl who had stumbled into the wilderness, with nothing but a knife and a cloak, had transformed into someone entirely different. Someone with a quiet, unshakable authority that commanded respect without demanding it. She had built this place with her own hands, her own strength, her own refusal to be defeated by what had been done to her. If the world wanted to call her a queen, she would not argue with the title. She had earned it. But even as her new life took shape, even as the settlement grew into something resembling a real community, with real structure and real hope, Ilara could not fully escape the shadow of what had happened to her. Some nights, alone in the small cabin the settlement had built for her, she found herself thinking of Cale, wondering if he ever regretted what he had done, wondering if the wedding to Seraphina Drake had already taken place, wondering if he ever thought of her at all. She hated herself a little, on those nights, for still caring. She had built an entire new life, had become someone strong and respected and needed, and yet some small, stubborn part of her heart still ached for the man who had thrown her away. She told herself it would fade with time. She told herself that the bond, once severed, would eventually stop haunting her dreams. But deep down, in the place where the mate bond had once lived, Ilara suspected that some connections, once formed, could never truly be erased, no matter how much distance or time stood between two people. She did not yet know that fate, in its own strange and patient way, was already working to bring her and Cale Ashbourne back into each other's paths, and that when that reunion finally came, neither of them would be the same people they once were. 2 years passed, and the settlement in the northern mountains no longer resembled the desperate scattering of exiles it had once been. What Ilara Voss had built now stretched across a wide valley, protected on 3 sides by steep cliffs, home to nearly 1,000 wolves who had once been cast out, forgotten, or hunted by the packs that should have protected them. They called it simply the Northern Haven, though outsiders had taken to calling it something else entirely, the Kingdom of the Wolf Queen. Ilara stood at the edge of the training grounds, watching a group of young wolves practice their combat forms under the guidance of one of her senior warriors, a woman named Louisa who had once been exiled from her pack for refusing an arranged mating. Louisa had arrived at the Haven 3 years ago, thin and frightened, and had grown into one of the fiercest fighters in the entire settlement. She was proof of what Ilara had always believed, that the wolves cast aside by the old system were not weak or broken. They simply needed a place where their strength could be recognized rather than punished. Their forms are improving, Louisa called out, noticing Ilara's approach. Give them another few months, and they'll be ready for patrol duty. Ilara nodded, watching the young wolves move through their exercises with growing confidence. Some of them had arrived at the Haven as small children, orphaned by pack conflicts or abandoned by families who could not afford another mouth to feed. Others had come as adults, already broken by years of mistreatment in packs that valued bloodlines over character. Regardless of where they had come from, the Haven had given them something they had never had before, a place to belong. How are the Eastern shelters coming along? Ilara asked, turning her attention to the practical matters that filled most of her days now. Leading a settlement of this size required constant attention to infrastructure, food supplies, defense, and the endless small disputes that arose whenever large numbers of people lived in close proximity. On schedule, Louisa replied. We should have housing ready for the new arrivals from the Thornfield territories by the end of the month. More refugees. It seemed that no matter how much the political landscape of the Wolf Kingdoms shifted, there was always a fresh wave of exiles seeking sanctuary in the north. Word of the haven had spread far and wide over the past 2 years, carried by traveling merchants and wandering wolves, transforming what had once been a secret refuge into something closer to a known destination for anyone failed by their own pack. This growing visibility brought both opportunities and dangers. The larger and more organized the haven became, the more it attracted the attention of established packs, some curious, some suspicious, and a few openly hostile toward the idea of a community that operated entirely outside the traditional pack hierarchy. Elara had spent the past year carefully building alliances with a handful of neutral packs willing to trade resources and information, while remaining vigilant against packs that viewed the haven as a threat to be eliminated, rather than a neighbor to be tolerated. It was this delicate political situation that brought Nathaniel Ford, one of her most trusted advisors, hurrying across the training grounds later that afternoon, his expression tense with news that clearly could not wait. "My queen," he said, using the title that had become customary among her people, even though Elara herself had never formally claimed it. "A messenger has arrived from the southern territories. There is to be a summit, called by the Alliance of Packs, to address the growing tensions along the border regions. They have extended an invitation to the northern haven." Elara raised an eyebrow, surprised by the news. In the 2 years since the haven had grown into a recognized power in its own right, the established packs had largely ignored its existence, unwilling to formally acknowledge a community built by exiles as a legitimate political entity. An invitation to a formal summit represented a significant shift in how the wider wolf world viewed what she had built. "Which packs are calling this summit?" she asked, already turning over the political implications in her mind. "The Drake Pack and the Crimson Moon Pack, jointly," Nathaniel said. "There have been escalating conflicts along the border between the Thornwood territories and the allied packs. They are hoping to negotiate a lasting peace before the situation escalates into open war." The Crimson Moon Pack. Elara felt something tighten in her chest at the mention of the name, a reflexive reaction she thought she had long since trained herself out of. 2 years had passed since the night she walked out of that great hall, and in that time, she had built an entire kingdom, had become someone entirely different from the girl who had begged Cale Ashbourne to reconsider his rejection. She told herself the old wounds had healed completely. But hearing the name of her old pack still sent a small tremor through her carefully constructed composure. "Why would they invite us?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. "The established packs have never recognized the haven as anything more than a collection of rogues." "Our numbers have grown too large to ignore," Nathaniel said, "and our territory now borders several of the contested regions. Whatever peace they hope to negotiate, it seems they have realized it cannot be achieved without our cooperation." Elara considered this for a long moment, weighing the risks and benefits of formal engagement with the very political system that had discarded her. Attending the summit meant stepping back into a world she had deliberately left behind, meant potentially facing Cale Ashbourne face to face for the first time since the rejection ceremony. It was a daunting prospect, one that stirred up emotions she had spent 2 years trying to bury. But it also represented an opportunity. The haven had grown strong, but it remained vulnerable to the whims of the established packs, who could still, if they chose, treat her people as trespassers on contested land. Formal recognition, secured through participation in a legitimate summit, could provide the kind of legal and political protection that raw strength alone could not guarantee. "We will attend," Elara said finally, her decision made. "But we go as equals, Nathaniel, not as supplicants seeking permission to exist. If the established packs want the cooperation of the Northern Haven, they will treat us with the respect our people have earned." Nathaniel nodded, a small smile of approval crossing his face. "I will send word confirming our attendance. The summit is scheduled to take place in 3 weeks, at the neutral grounds near the Silver Pine border." 3 weeks. Elara had 3 weeks to prepare herself for a confrontation she had spent 2 years avoiding. 3 weeks, to steel herself against the possibility of standing in the same room as Cale Ashbourne, seeing him again, after everything that had happened, everything she had built in the aftermath of what he had done to her. She spent those 3 weeks in a whirlwind of preparation, organizing delegations, briefing her advisors on negotiation strategies, and training herself, both mentally and physically, for whatever awaited her at the summit. She refused to admit, even to herself, how much time she also spent thinking about how she would look, how she would carry herself, how she would present the woman she had become to the man who had once discarded her. On the morning the delegation was set to depart, Louisa found Ilara standing in front of a small mirror in her cabin, dressed in the formal attire that had been crafted specifically for this occasion. A deep blue tunic, embroidered with silver thread, fitted to allow for quick movement if combat became necessary, but elegant enough to command respect in a formal political setting. Her dark hair was pulled back in a style that emphasized the sharp lines of her face, and her eyes, once soft and trusting, now carried the steady, watchful quality of someone who had learned to read danger in every room she entered. "You look every bit the queen they've been whispering about," Louisa said from the doorway, a note of pride in her voice. "I don't feel like a queen," Ilara admitted, turning away from the mirror. "I feel like I'm about to walk back into a fire I barely survived the first time." "You're not the same person who walked out of that fire 2 years ago," Louisa said firmly. "Whatever waits for you at that summit, you are not facing it alone, and you are not facing it as the girl who was rejected. You are facing it as the woman who built a kingdom out of the pieces that were left behind." Ilara took a steadying breath, absorbing the truth in her friend's words. Louisa was right. Whatever happened at the summit, whatever emotions surfaced when she inevitably saw Kale again, she would not let herself be reduced back into the broken, powerless girl from that night in the Great Hall. She had earned every inch of the strength she now carried, and she would walk into that summit as its rightful owner. The journey to the Silver Pine border took the better part of a week. The delegation from the Northern Haven, traveling through territories that had once been forbidden to exiles, now grudgingly opening their borders to allow safe passage for a summit meant to prevent the outbreak of a larger war. Ilara traveled alongside Nathaniel, Louisa, and Edmund, along with a small honor guard, chosen from among the Haven's most capable warriors, all of them aware of the weight of what this journey represented. As they approached the neutral grounds where the summit would take place, a large clearing marked by ancient standing stones, said to predate even the oldest pack territories, Ilara felt her composure being tested more with each passing mile. She could sense, even from a distance, the presence of numerous other delegations already gathered, the mingled sense of different packs creating a complex tapestry of tension and formal courtesy that hung over the entire area. The clearing itself had been arranged with careful attention to protocol, a large central platform surrounded by seating areas designated for each participating pack, banners and markers indicating territorial boundaries even within the neutral space. Ilara's delegation was directed to a section on the eastern side of the clearing, a placement that Nathaniel quietly noted as a subtle test of the Haven's willingness to accept a position that was neither central nor peripheral, a deliberate ambiguity about how much respect the established packs were truly willing to extend. Ilara accepted the placement without complaint, understanding that pushing back on minor slights would accomplish nothing productive at this stage. There would be time enough to assert the Haven's standing through substance rather than symbolism. As the delegation settled into their designated areas and the formal proceedings began to take shape, Ilara found herself scanning the gathered crowd, searching for a face she had spent 2 years trying to forget. She spotted the banner of the Crimson Moon Pack first, its crimson and gold colors unmistakable even from a distance, and her heart began to pound with a mixture of dread and something she refused to name. Then she saw him. Cale Ashbourne stood at the head of his pack's delegation, dressed in formal attire, befitting an Alpha King, his broad shoulders held with the same commanding presence she remembered, though something about him had changed in the 2 years since she had last seen him. There was a heaviness to his expression, a tightness around his eyes that spoke of burdens carried too long without relief. He had not yet noticed her. His attention focused on a conversation with one of his advisors, and for a brief moment, Ilara allowed herself the luxury of studying him without the complication of his awareness. She noted the changes time had etched into his features, the way his once easy confidence now seemed weighted by responsibility, the way his eyes, even in casual conversation, carried a wariness that had not been there before. Whatever the past 2 years had held for him, they had clearly not been without their own struggles. Beside him stood a woman with dark hair and green eyes, dressed in fine silver silk, her posture perfect and composed. Serafina Drake, Ilara realized, the Luna who had taken her place. Watching the two of them together, Ilara searched for some sign of the closeness one would expect between a mated couple, some warmth or ease that would confirm Cale had found genuine happiness in the arrangement he had chosen over her. Instead, she noted a certain formal distance between them, a careful courtesy that felt more like political partnership than the warmth of a chosen bond. She did not have time to dwell on the observation before the summit's proceedings officially began, a horn sounding across the clearing to signal the start of formal negotiations. Representatives from each delegation would be called forward to state their positions on the border conflicts and propose solutions for lasting peace. As the various pacts presented their cases, Ilara watched Cale carefully, noting the way he spoke with practiced authority, the way his pact's advisors deferred to his judgment, the way he carried the weight of leadership with the same steady competence she remembered from before everything had gone wrong between them. When the time came for the Northern Havens delegation to be called forward, a murmur rippled through the gathered crowd. Many of the established pacts had never formally interacted with representatives from the Haven, and curiosity mingled with skepticism as Ilara rose from her seat and walked toward the central platform, Nathaniel and Louisa flanking her on either side. She felt Cale's gaze land on her the moment she stepped into full view, felt the weight of his sudden, complete attention like a physical force. She kept her own expression carefully neutral, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing any reaction from her, refusing to let 2 years of hard-won composure crack in front of an audience of hundreds. But as she reached the central platform and turned to face the assembled delegations, she could not avoid the moment their eyes finally met directly, could not avoid the shock that passed visibly across Cale's face as recognition dawned, as the mysterious Wolf Queen of the Northern Haven revealed herself to be the very woman he had rejected 2 years ago in front of his entire pack. The silence that followed stretched for only a moment, but to both of them, it felt like an eternity. 2 years of separation and transformation, compressed into a single charged glance across a crowded clearing. Ilara was the first to break the silence, her voice steady and clear as she addressed the assembled delegations. I am Ilara Voss, representing the Northern Haven. We have come to discuss terms for lasting peace along the contested border territories. She did not acknowledge Cale directly, did not give any indication that his presence affected her in any way beyond the professional courtesy owed to any fellow delegation leader. But she could feel his eyes on her throughout the entirety of her formal address, could sense the storm of emotions he was struggling to contain behind his own carefully maintained composure. Whatever peace this summit was meant to achieve between the various pact territories, Ilara understood, watching Cale's face across the crowded clearing, that a far more personal reckoning had just begun between the two of them, one that would not be resolved through formal negotiations or political protocol, but through a far more difficult confrontation with everything that had happened, everything that had changed, and everything that still, despite 2 years and an entire kingdom built from nothing, remained unresolved between the Alpha King and the Wolf Queen he had once cast aside. The formal proceedings of the summit continued for hours after that first devastating moment of recognition, but Cale Ashbourne absorbed almost none of it. He sat through discussions of border markers and trade agreements, nodded at appropriate intervals, and offered brief responses when directly addressed, but his mind remained fixed entirely on the woman standing across the clearing, the impossible truth of her presence settling into him like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through every certainty he had built his life upon for the past 2 years. Ilara, his Ilara, the girl he had rejected in front of his entire pack, the girl he had told himself had likely found some quiet, unremarkable life far away from the political world that had discarded her. And here she was, not diminished by exile as he had unconsciously assumed, but transformed into someone commanding an entire delegation, speaking with the authority of a leader who had clearly built something significant in the years since he had last seen her. He forced himself to study her objectively, the way he might study any other delegation leader at this summit, cataloging the changes without allowing himself to dwell on what they meant. Her posture was different, straighter, more deliberate, the posture of someone accustomed to being watched and evaluated by others who depended on her judgment. Her voice, when she spoke, carried a calm authority that had not been there 2 years ago, a steadiness that suggested she had weathered challenges he could only guess at. Even her expression seemed different, guarded in a way that felt foreign coming from the woman he remembered as open and warm, quick to laugh, quick to trust. He had done that to her. Whatever transformation had occurred in the years since her exile, he understood with a sick certainty that his own actions had set it in motion. "You seem distracted," Serafina murmured beside him, her voice pitched low enough to avoid drawing attention from the surrounding delegations. "Is something wrong?" Cale forced his attention away from Alara, meeting his wife's perceptive gaze. Serafina had always been observant, quick to notice shifts in his mood even when he tried to conceal them. He had never told her the full story of what had happened with Alara, had allowed the pack's carefully constructed narrative of political necessity to stand unchallenged. But watching her now, he wondered how much longer he could maintain that fiction. "It's nothing," he said, the lie feeling heavier on his tongue than it ever had before. "Just concerns about the border negotiations." Serafina's gaze flickered toward the Eastern delegation, toward the woman who had just finished her formal address, and something in her expression shifted, a dawning understanding that Cale could not quite interpret. "That is the leader of the Northern Haven delegation," she said slowly. "Alara Voss." Cale's jaw tightened at the sound of the name spoken aloud between them. "Yes, you know her." It was not a question, and Cale understood there was no point in denying what Serafina had clearly already pieced together from his reaction. "We were pack members together, before you arrived," he said carefully, choosing his words with the precision of a man walking through a minefield. "A long time ago." Serafina studied him for a long moment, her sharp green eyes searching his face for the details he was deliberately withholding. Whatever she saw there, she chose not to press further, at least not in the middle of a formal political summit, surrounded by representatives from every major pack territory. But Cale understood, from the careful way she turned back to the proceedings, that this conversation was far from finished between them. The summit broke for a midday recess, delegations dispersing across the clearing to rest, eat, and engage in the informal networking that often proved just as important as the formal negotiations themselves. Cale found himself unable to sit still, his wolf restless beneath his skin, agitated by Alara's proximity in a way he had not experienced in 2 years. He made his excuses to Serafina and his advisors, claiming he needed to walk off the tension of the morning's proceedings, and made his way toward the edge of the clearing, ostensibly to clear his head. In truth, he was searching for her. He found Alara standing alone near a small stream that ran along the boundary of the neutral grounds, apparently taking advantage of the recess to gather her own thoughts away from the crowds. She heard his approach before he spoke, her posture stiffening slightly, though she did not turn to face him immediately. "I would think a delegation leader would have better things to do than wander off during negotiations," she said finally, her voice carefully neutral, giving away nothing of whatever emotions the encounter stirred within her. "I needed a moment," Cale said, stopping a respectful distance away, unsure of how close he was permitted to come, unsure of what rights he retained, if any, to her time and attention after everything that had happened between them. "Alara, Alpha King Ashbourne," she interrupted smoothly, finally turning to face him, her expression carefully composed into something diplomatic and distant. "I trust the negotiations have been satisfactory from your pack's perspective." The formal address landed like a deliberate blow, a clear signal that whatever personal history existed between them, she intended to keep their interactions confined strictly to the professional. Cale felt something painful twist in his chest at the coldness of it, though he understood, with a fairness that surprised even himself, that he had no right to expect anything warmer from her. "Alara, please," he said, abandoning any pretense of formality. "I know I have no right to ask this of you, but can we speak honestly, just for a moment, not as delegation leaders, as two people who once knew each other?" Something flickered across her face, quick and difficult to read, gone before he could properly identify it. "There is nothing to discuss, Cale," she said, and the use of his given name, rather than his formal title, felt like a strange concession, even as her tone remained cool. "What happened between us happened 2 years ago. I have built a new life since then. I would prefer to keep our current interactions focused entirely on the matters at hand." "You built a kingdom," Cale said, unable to keep a note of genuine awe from creeping into his voice, despite his best efforts to match her composed distance. "The Northern Haven. I had heard rumors of a settlement in the north, but I never imagined. He stopped himself, aware of how the words might sound, aware of how little right he had to express admiration for what she had accomplished in the aftermath of the pain he had caused her. You never imagined that the girl you rejected could build something of value on her own, Ilara finished for him, her voice sharpening slightly despite her attempt to maintain composure. I understand the surprise, Kale. I did not imagine it either, on the night you cast me out. But desperation has a way of revealing strengths a person did not know they possessed. Kale flinched at the barely concealed pain beneath her words, understanding that despite the 2 years and the impressive kingdom she had built, the wound he had inflicted had not fully healed, perhaps could never fully heal, regardless of how successful she had become in the aftermath. I never doubted your strength, he said quietly. I doubted my own ability to give you the life you deserved while also protecting my pack. That was my failure, not a reflection of your worth. Ilara's expression tightened, and for a moment, Kale thought he saw genuine anger flash in her eyes, a fierceness that had not been present 2 years ago. Forged, he understood, by everything she had survived since then. Do not stand here and offer me explanations 2 years too late, Kale Ashbourne, she said, her voice low and controlled but carrying an unmistakable edge. You made your choice in front of the entire pack. You chose your throne over your bond. Whatever regret you feel now does not undo what happened, and it certainly does not entitle you to my forgiveness or my understanding. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Kale said, though even as he spoke the words, he wondered if that was entirely true. I'm asking for the chance to acknowledge what I did wrong. To you, honestly, without hiding behind political justifications. Ilara studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable, and Kale found himself holding his breath, uncertain what response he was hoping for, uncertain what outcome could possibly satisfy the tangled mess of guilt and longing and regret that had been building inside him for 2 years. Acknowledgement does not change anything, she said finally, her voice softer now, though no less resolute. I have built a life for myself, Kale, a life that does not require your validation or your regret. Whatever happens at this summit, I would ask that we keep our interactions strictly professional, for both our sakes, and for the sake of the people who depend on us. Before Kale could respond, the sound of a horn echoed across the clearing, signaling the resumption of formal proceedings. Ilara turned without another word, and walked back toward the central gathering area, her posture once again perfectly composed, giving no outward sign of the difficult conversation that had just passed between them. Kale remained by the stream for a long moment after she left, staring at the water without truly seeing it, the weight of her words settling over him like a physical burden. She was right, of course. His acknowledgement, however genuine, could not undo 2 years of pain, could not restore what had been broken between them in that great hall. But something about seeing her again, about hearing the strength in her voice even as she spoke of the pain he had caused her, had reignited something in his chest that he had spent 2 years trying to suppress. The mate bond, he realized with a growing sense of dread, had never actually been severed. He had convinced himself, in the aftermath of the rejection ceremony, that the bond was gone, that whatever connection had once existed between them had been permanently broken by his own deliberate choice. But standing here, feeling the pull of her presence even from a distance, feeling his wolf's restless agitation calm slightly in her proximity, despite the coldness of their conversation, he understood that he had been lying to himself for 2 years. The bond remained, damaged perhaps, strained by betrayal and separation and 2 years of enforced distance, but it remained, stubbornly persistent, refusing to be erased by political convenience or willful denial. He made his way back toward the summit proceedings with a growing sense of unease, aware that whatever careful balance he had constructed in his life over the past 2 years, the reappearance of Ilara Voss as the powerful leader of the Northern Haven had just thrown everything into uncertain, dangerous flux. Serafina watched him approach with sharp, assessing eyes, and Kale understood that his wife had likely already begun to suspect the true nature of the history between him and the mysterious Wolf Queen. Whatever came next, at this summit and beyond it, Kale understood that he could no longer avoid confronting the consequences of the choice he had made 2 years ago. The past had returned, transformed and formidable, and it would not be so easily dismissed a second time. The formal negotiations stretched across 3 full days, each session bringing new tensions to the surface, as the various pack delegations argued over border markers, resource rights, and the terms of a lasting peace that would prevent the escalating conflicts along the eastern territories from erupting into full-scale war. Alara found herself constantly balancing the demands of representing the Northern Haven's interests with the exhausting effort of maintaining her composure whenever Kale's presence pulled at her attention across the crowded clearing. By the second day, it had become clear to every delegation present that the Northern Haven's cooperation would be essential to any lasting resolution. The territory Alara's people had claimed and cultivated over the past 2 years bordered several of the most contested regions, and her people's growing military strength, forged through years of necessity in a harsh and unforgiving wilderness, made the Haven a force too significant to be dismissed or overlooked any longer. This reality was not lost on the other delegation leaders, many of whom approached Alara during the breaks between formal sessions, seeking to establish favorable relationships with the increasingly influential Wolf Queen. Alpha Drake, Seraphina's father, and the leader of one of the summit's host packs, made a point of personally introducing himself to Alara on the second day, his shrewd eyes assessing her with the calculating interest of a seasoned political operator, recognizing a rising power. "Your people have accomplished something remarkable," Alpha Drake said, his tone carrying genuine respect beneath its careful diplomatic polish. "Building a functioning community from nothing but exiles and outcasts is no small feat. Many established packs would struggle to maintain the kind of order and cooperation you have apparently achieved." "We simply gave people a reason to believe they were worth protecting," Alara replied evenly, well aware that Alpha Drake's compliments served a strategic purpose, likely aimed at securing favorable terms in whatever agreements emerged from this summit. Something many of the established packs failed to provide them. If Alpha Drake caught the pointed edge beneath her words, he did not show it, merely nodding thoughtfully, before steering the conversation toward more practical matters of trade and border cooperation. Alara navigated the exchange with the same careful diplomacy she applied to all her interactions at the summit, mindful that every conversation, every alliance, every subtle shift in perceived power could affect the long-term security of the people who depended on her leadership. It was during one such exchange, late on the second afternoon, that Alara found herself unexpectedly cornered by Seraphina Drake, who approached with the same composed grace Alara had observed throughout the summit proceedings, though something in her expression suggested this encounter carried more personal weight than the political networking that had dominated most of the gathering. "Lady Voss," Seraphina said, using a formal address that acknowledged Alara's standing without presuming familiarity. "I wonder if I might have a word with you, away from the crowds." Alara hesitated, aware of the awkward complexity of the situation. Whatever history existed between herself and Kale, Seraphina was, by all accounts, an innocent party, caught in the middle of consequences she had not created. "Of course," Alara said, gesturing toward a quieter section of the clearing, away from the main gathering. Once they had found a measure of privacy, Seraphina studied Alara for a long moment before speaking. "I know who you are to Kale," she said finally, her directness catching Alara slightly off guard. "Not the political details of your departure from the Crimson Moon Pack, but the deeper truth of it. I have seen the way he watches you across this clearing, the way his composure slips whenever your name is mentioned. You were his fated mate." Alara's expression remained carefully controlled, though internally, she felt a jolt of surprise at Seraphina's directness. "That bond was severed 2 years ago," she said carefully. "Whatever remains of it does not concern your marriage, Lady Drake." "Doesn't it?" Seraphina asked, a note of genuine weariness entering her voice. "I have spent 2 years married to a man who performs every duty expected of him with perfect competence, and yet remains distant, guarded, as though some essential part of him is permanently withheld. I told myself it was simply the nature of an arranged political marriage, that warmth would grow slowly over time. But watching him these past 3 days, watching the way his entire demeanor has shifted since your arrival, I understand now that I have been competing with a ghost this entire time, without even knowing her name." Alara felt an unexpected pang of sympathy for the other woman, understanding, despite everything, that Seraphina had also been caught in circumstances not entirely of her own making. "I am sorry," she said honestly, "for whatever pain this situation has caused you. That was never my intention." "I do not believe it was," Seraphina said, studying Alara with an expression that held more curiosity than hostility. You have built something extraordinary, Lady Voss. An entire community, a functioning power in its own right, all from the wreckage of what my husband did to you. I confess, I find myself more curious than resentful about the woman capable of such a transformation. What is it you want from me? Alara asked, unsure of where this conversation was heading, uncertain whether Serafina intended confrontation or something more complicated. Honesty, Serafina said simply. I have spent 2 years in a marriage built on political convenience, wondering why my husband seems perpetually haunted by something he refuses to discuss. Now I understand what that something is. I do not know what I intend to do with this knowledge, Lady Voss, but I would rather face the truth clearly than continue living in careful, polite ignorance. Before Alara could formulate a response to this unexpectedly candid admission, the sound of raised voices drew both women's attention back toward the central gathering area, where the formal negotiations appeared to have hit a significant obstacle. Several delegation leaders had risen from their seats, gesturing angrily at a map spread across the central platform, while others attempted to calm the escalating tension. It seems the negotiations have taken a turn, Serafina observed, her diplomatic instincts immediately overriding the personal conversation they had been having. We should return. As they made their way back toward the central platform, Alara caught fragments of the heated exchange taking place among the delegation leaders. Apparently, representatives from the Thornwood Pack, one of the parties whose border conflicts had prompted this summit in the first place, had rejected the proposed territorial arrangement, accusing the allied packs of attempting to claim resources that rightfully belonged to Thornwood ancestral lands. This arrangement is unacceptable, the Thornwood Alpha declared loudly, his voice carrying across the entire clearing. You expect us to surrender the eastern mining territories without adequate compensation? This is not negotiation. This is theft, dressed in diplomatic language. Kale, standing at the head of his own delegation, attempted to mediate the escalating dispute. The proposed arrangement includes significant trade concessions that would benefit the Thornwood territories substantially over time, he said, his voice carrying the steady authority of an experienced leader, attempting to defuse a volatile situation. If we can find a way to address your immediate concerns about the mining resources specifically, perhaps we can salvage a workable agreement. Your pack has never shown genuine interest in Thornwood's welfare, the Thornwood Alpha shot back, his tone sharp with years of accumulated grievance. Why should we trust your concessions now? The argument continued to escalate, with various delegation leaders taking sides based on their own territorial interests and long-standing alliances, the fragile cooperation that had characterized the summit's earlier proceedings threatening to collapse entirely under the weight of competing demands. Alara watched the deteriorating situation with growing concern, understanding that the failure of these negotiations would likely result in exactly the kind of open conflict the summit had been convened to prevent. A conflict that would inevitably spill over into territories bordering the Northern Haven. Finally, unable to watch the negotiations collapse without offering some intervention, Alara stepped forward, her voice cutting through the escalating argument, with a calm authority that drew immediate attention from every delegation present. If I may offer a perspective from outside your existing alliances and grievances, she said, waiting until the clearing had fallen into attentive silence before continuing. The Northern Haven has no historical claim to the disputed mining territories, and therefore no vested interest in how they are ultimately divided. But we do have significant interest in seeing this conflict resolved peacefully, given our proximity to the contested regions. Every eye in the clearing turned toward her, curiosity and calculation mingling in the various expressions of the assembled delegation leaders. Alara continued, laying out a proposal that had been forming in her mind over the past 3 days, of observing the various packs' competing interests and underlying insecurities. What if the mining territories were placed under joint stewardship, with resource extraction rights divided according to a fixed percentage agreement, monitored by a neutral third party? She suggested. The Northern Haven would be willing to serve in that neutral monitoring capacity, given our position outside the existing web of alliances and rivalries that have made this negotiation so difficult. A murmur of consideration rippled through the gathered delegations. The proposal offered a creative solution to the impasse, one that addressed the Thornwood Pack's concerns about fair compensation while providing the other packs with continued access to resources they had come to depend upon. More importantly, it positioned the Northern Haven as a legitimate, trusted power capable of neutral arbitration, a significant elevation in status for a community that had begun as nothing more than a scattering of desperate exiles. The Thornwood Alpha studied Alara for a long moment, clearly weighing the practical benefits of her proposal against whatever reservations he might harbor about trusting an unfamiliar, unproven power with such an important role. And what guarantee do we have that the Northern Haven would administer this arrangement fairly, without favoring the larger, more established packs? You have my word, Alara said simply, meeting his gaze without hesitation. And you have the reputation my people have built over the past 2 years, a reputation grounded in fairness toward everyone who has sought refuge within our territory, regardless of their former pack affiliations or standing. We have no interest in playing favorites among the established packs. Our only interest is in maintaining the peace that allows our community to continue growing and thriving. The Thornwood Alpha considered this for a long moment, before finally nodding, a gesture that seemed to release the tension that had been building throughout the clearing. Very well, he said. The Thornwood Pack is willing to accept this arrangement, provided the other delegations agree to the terms as well. One by one, the other delegation leaders voiced their agreement. The crisis that had threatened to derail the entire summit resolved through Alara's unexpected intervention. As the formal proceedings resumed with renewed momentum toward finalizing the broader peace agreement, Alara caught Kale watching her from across the clearing, his expression carrying an unmistakable mixture of admiration and something more complicated, something that looked almost like the ache of watching someone you had lost become more remarkable than you had ever imagined possible. She held his gaze for a moment longer than strictly necessary, before turning her attention back to the ongoing negotiations, refusing to let herself dwell on whatever emotions passed between them in that brief, charged exchange. Whatever complicated history remained unresolved between them, she reminded herself firmly, she had a peace agreement to help finalize, and a people depending on her leadership. Personal matters, however unresolved, would have to wait. But as the summit's third and final day drew toward its conclusion, with the broader peace agreement finally reaching a state of general consensus among all participating delegations, Alara understood that the personal reckoning she had been postponing throughout the negotiations could not be avoided indefinitely. Kale Ashbourne remained an unavoidable presence in her life now, whether she wished it or not, and the political ties this summit had begun forging between the Northern Haven and the established pack territories ensured that their paths would continue crossing in the months and years ahead. Whatever came next, she understood, would require a far more difficult confrontation than anything the formal negotiations had demanded of her. The summit concluded on the fourth morning with the formal signing of the peace agreement, a document that established new border protocols, resource-sharing arrangements, and, most significantly for the Northern Haven, formal recognition of Alara's territory as a legitimate political entity with standing equal to the established packs. As the various delegation leaders affixed their marks to the agreement, a sense of cautious relief settled over the gathered crowd, the threat of open war along the eastern territories averted, at least for the time being. Alara should have felt triumphant. Her people had achieved formal recognition that would protect them from future territorial disputes, had secured trade agreements that would improve the haven's economic stability, and had established Alara herself as a respected figure among the wider political landscape of the Wolf Kingdoms. By any measure, the summit had been an unqualified success for everything she had worked to build over the past 2 years. Instead, as she watched Kale sign the agreement alongside the other Alpha leaders, she felt only a hollow, complicated ache that she could not fully name. The delegations began the process of dispersing that afternoon, each group preparing for the journey back to their respective territories. Alara oversaw the packing of her own delegation's supplies with practiced efficiency, grateful for the distraction of practical tasks that kept her mind occupied and away from the unresolved tangle of emotions that had been building throughout the summit's proceedings. It was as her delegation prepared to depart that Kale approached her one final time, his expression carrying a determination that suggested he would not be deterred by another cool, formal dismissal. "Alara," he said, positioning himself directly in her path as she moved between supply carts, leaving her little room to avoid the conversation without appearing deliberately rude in front of the observing delegations still finalizing their own departures. "I know you asked me to keep our interactions professional, and I have tried to respect that throughout this summit. But I cannot let you leave without saying what I actually need to say." Ilara felt her carefully maintained composure waver slightly. Exhaustion from 4 days of intense political maneuvering, combined with the constant strain of his presence beginning to erode her defenses. "Kale, please. Whatever you need to say, I am not certain it will change anything between us." "Perhaps not," he acknowledged, his voice carrying an unfamiliar vulnerability that she had not heard from him even during their earlier conversation by the stream. "But I need you to hear it regardless. What I did to you in that hall was wrong, not politically inconvenient, not a difficult but necessary sacrifice. Wrong. I chose fear over faith, convenience over commitment, and I have spent every day since then living with the consequences of that choice, watching my own wolf grieve a bond I convinced myself I could simply set aside." Ilara stood still, absorbing his words, aware of Nathaniel and Louisa hovering at a respectful distance, giving her space for this conversation, while remaining close enough to intervene if needed. "Why tell me this now?" she asked finally, 2 years too late, in the middle of a political summit, surrounded by delegations from every major pact territory. "Because I nearly let another opportunity pass without saying it," Cale admitted. "I told myself, after our conversation by the stream, that I had said enough, that pressing further would only cause you more pain. But watching you these past 4 days, watching everything you built, everything you became, I realized that my silence has always been the coward's choice. I owe you honesty, Ilara, regardless of whether it changes anything between us." "And what would you have me do with this honesty?" Ilara asked, her voice tighter now, the careful composure she had maintained throughout the summit finally beginning to crack under the weight of this unexpected confrontation. "I have built an entire life without you, Cale. A kingdom, a purpose, a community that depends on my strength and my judgment. I cannot simply set that aside, because you have finally found the courage to acknowledge your mistake." "I am not asking you to set anything aside," Cale said quickly. "I would never ask that of you, not after everything you have accomplished. I am only asking that you know the truth. The bond between us was never actually severed, Ilara. I have felt it every single day for 2 years. An ache that never fully faded, no matter how much I tried to convince myself otherwise. Seeing you here, seeing what you have built, has only made that ache impossible to ignore any longer." Ilara felt something inside her chest tighten painfully at his admission, the ghost of the bond she too had never quite managed to extinguish stirring in response to his words. She had told herself, over 2 years of building the Northern Haven, that whatever connection had once existed between them had faded into irrelevance, replaced by the purpose and community she had found among her people. Hearing him speak of an ache that mirrored her own unwelcome longing threatened to unravel the careful emotional walls she had constructed. "It doesn't matter," she said finally, forcing steel back into her voice, even as her heart pounded with the effort of denying what his words had stirred in her. "You are married, Cale, to Serafina. Whatever remains of the bond between us, you made your choice 2 years ago, and I have built my life around the consequences of that choice. I will not become the reason for further complications in your marriage or your leadership of the Crimson Moon Pack." "Serafina already knows," Cale said quietly. "She confronted me about it herself, during this summit. She suspected the truth long before either of us confirmed it directly." This admission caught Ilara off guard, and she found herself thinking back to her own unexpected conversation with Serafina, the other woman's candid acknowledgement of the distance she had sensed in her marriage. "What did you tell her?" "The truth," Cale said. "That you were my fated mate, that I rejected you for political reasons I have come to deeply regret, and that the bond between us has never fully faded, despite everything that has happened since." "And how did she respond to that truth?" Ilara asked, genuinely curious about how Serafina had processed this confirmation of what she had clearly already suspected. "She was hurt," Cale admitted, understandably so. "But she also expressed something I did not expect, a kind of relief, at finally understanding the source of the distance she had sensed between us throughout our marriage. She told me that a marriage built on lies, even lies of omission, could never provide either of us with genuine happiness or partnership." Ilara considered this information carefully, aware that the situation had grown far more complicated than she had anticipated when she agreed to attend this summit. "What does this mean for your marriage?" she asked. "For your pack? A public dissolution of your bond with Serafina could destabilize the very alliance this summit was meant to strengthen. I don't know yet, Kale admitted honestly. Serafina and I have agreed to discuss the matter further once we return to our respective territories, away from the pressures of this summit. Whatever we decide, I wanted you to know the truth first, before any decisions are made that might affect all of our lives. Ilara studied him for a long moment, aware of the complicated tangle of political and personal considerations that now stretched before all three of them, herself, Kale, and Serafina, each caught in the aftermath of a choice made 2 years ago in a moment of political expediency. I appreciate your honesty, Kale, she said finally, but I need you to understand something clearly. I did not build the Northern Haven, waiting for you to change your mind. I built it because I needed to survive, and because the people who found their way to me deserved someone willing to fight for their well-being. Whatever happens between you and Serafina, whatever remains of the bond between us, my first responsibility will always be to the people who depend on my leadership. I would never ask you to compromise that, Kale said. I have watched you these past 4 days, lead your delegation with more genuine care and competence than I have seen from any alpha at this summit, myself included. Whatever future exists between us, if any future exists at all, I understand it must be built on respect for everything you have accomplished, not on some assumption that you would simply abandon your kingdom to return to a life you were forced to leave behind. The sincerity in his words struck something deep within Ilara, a recognition that the man standing before her had indeed changed in the 2 years since she had last known him, tempered by the same kind of hard-won wisdom that had shaped her own transformation. But recognition of his growth did not erase 2 years of pain, did not automatically restore trust that had been so thoroughly shattered by his public rejection. I need time, Kale, she said finally. Time to process everything that has happened at this summit. Time to understand what, if anything, remains possible between us, after everything that has passed. I cannot promise you an answer today, or even in the near future. That is more than I have any right to ask for, Kale said, his expression carrying a mixture of hope and resigned patience. Take whatever time you need, Ilara. I will not pursue you further, will not pressure you toward any particular decision, but I needed you to know the truth, regardless of what you choose to do with it. As Ilara's delegation finally departed the neutral grounds later that afternoon, beginning the long journey back to the Northern Haven, she found herself replaying the conversation with Kale over and over in her mind, unable to settle the storm of conflicting emotions his honesty had stirred within her. 2 years of hard-won peace, of building a purpose entirely separate from the pain of her rejection, now felt suddenly, uncomfortably uncertain, disrupted by the reappearance of feelings she had believed thoroughly buried. Louisa, riding alongside her on the journey home, noticed her friend's distracted silence, and finally broke the quiet that had settled over their small group. You've barely spoken since we left the summit grounds, she observed gently. Whatever Kale Ashbourne said to you, it's clearly weighing on your mind. He told me the bond was never actually severed, Ilara admitted quietly, sharing the burden of her confusion with the one person she trusted most completely. That he has felt it every day for 2 years, the same as I have, if I am honest with myself. And what do you feel, now that you know this? Louisa asked. Ilara considered the question carefully, searching for an honest answer beneath the layers of anger, hurt, longing, and hard-won independence that had defined her emotional landscape for the past 2 years. I don't know, she said finally. I built an entire kingdom to prove that I did not need him, that his rejection could not define or destroy me, and I believe that remains true, regardless of whatever happens between us now. But I also cannot pretend that hearing him acknowledge the truth, after 2 years of silence, has not affected me deeply. Perhaps, Louisa suggested carefully, the strength you built does not require you to reject any possibility of reconciliation in order to remain valid. You are not the same woman who begged him to reconsider in that great hall. Whatever happens next, you would be entering it as an equal, as someone who has already proven she can survive and thrive without him. That is a fundamentally different position than the one you occupied 2 years ago. Ilara turned this perspective over in her mind as their delegation continued the long journey home, the northern mountains gradually rising into view on the horizon, marking the boundaries of the kingdom she had built with her own hands, her own strength, her own refusal to be destroyed by betrayal. Whatever came next in her complicated, unresolved history with Kale Ashbourne, Louisa was right about one crucial truth. She would face it not as a victim seeking validation, but as a queen who had already claimed her own worth, independent of any man's recognition. That knowledge, at least, offered a measure of steady ground beneath the uncertain path that stretched ahead. News of what had transpired at the summit traveled faster than Cale anticipated, carried by the delegations returning to their respective territories, spreading through the informal networks that connected pack members across even the most distant kingdoms. By the time Cale's own delegation returned to the Crimson Moon Pack, rumors had already begun circulating through his own territory. Whispered speculation about the true nature of his history with the mysterious Wolf Queen of the Northern Haven. Cale had hoped for more time to navigate the delicate situation with Serafina before the pack at large became aware of the complications stirring beneath the surface of his marriage. Instead, he found himself facing an anxious council of advisors within days of his return, all of them eager for reassurance that the pack's carefully constructed alliance with the Drake territory remained stable, despite the troubling rumors. Alpha King, one senior advisor said during an emergency council meeting convened to address the growing unrest, "There are concerning reports circulating throughout the pack regarding your interactions with the leader of the Northern Haven delegation. Given the sensitivity of our alliance with the Drake pack, we felt it necessary to address these concerns directly." Cale sat at the head of the council table, aware of the weight of every eye in the room fixed upon him, waiting for his response. He had spent the journey home from the summit considering how to handle this exact situation, weighing the political consequences of honesty against the continued cost of concealment. "The rumors are not entirely unfounded," he said finally, deciding that further evasion would only compound the damage already spreading through his pack. "Ilara Voss was my fated mate before I rejected her, 2 years ago, for the sake of the alliance with the Drake pack. Seeing her again at the summit has raised difficult questions that I am currently working to resolve, both personally and politically." A tense silence fell over the council chamber, advisors exchanging uneasy glances as they processed this direct confirmation of what had previously existed only as speculation. "Alpha King," another advisor ventured cautiously, "if this is true, what does it mean for your marriage to Lady Serafina, and for the stability of our alliance with the Drake territory?" "That remains to be determined," Cale said honestly. "Serafina and I are discussing the matter privately. I would ask that this council refrain from further speculation until we have reached a resolution that serves both our personal circumstances and the political interests of our pack." The council meeting concluded with more questions than answers, and Cale understood that the uncertainty hovering over his marriage would continue to create instability within his pack until some clear resolution emerged. That evening he found Serafina in her private chambers, staring out at the training grounds below, with an expression of careful contemplation that suggested she too had been wrestling with the implications of everything the summit had revealed. "The council knows," Cale said, announcing his presence as he entered the room. The rumors had already spread too widely to maintain the pretense of ignorance. Serafina turned to face him, her expression composed but weary, the strain of the past few days visible in the faint shadows beneath her eyes. "I suspected as much would happen eventually," she said. "News of this nature rarely stays contained for long, particularly among wolves, whose senses make secrecy nearly impossible to maintain." "I owe you a genuine conversation, Serafina," Cale said, sitting down across from her, understanding that whatever resolution emerged from this discussion would shape the futures of everyone involved, including the pack itself. "I have spent these past days considering everything that happened at the summit, everything you and I discussed there, and I believe we owe each other complete honesty about what we both actually want from this marriage." Serafina nodded slowly, folding her hands in her lap with the same composed grace that had characterized her presence since her arrival in the pack 2 years ago. "Very well. Let us be honest with each other then. For perhaps the first time since our marriage began. I care for you," Cale said carefully, choosing his words with deliberate honesty. "You have been a capable partner in leadership, and I respect you deeply, but I do not believe what exists between us has ever grown into the kind of bond a true marriage deserves. I think we both sensed this distance from the beginning, even if neither of us wished to acknowledge it directly." "I agree," Serafina said, her voice carrying a note of relief at finally speaking these truths aloud. I entered this marriage, understanding it as a political arrangement, and I accepted that reality willingly, for the sake of the alliance between our packs. But watching you at the summit, watching the way your entire demeanor shifted in Lady Voss's presence, I understood that you had been carrying an unresolved grief this entire time, one that made genuine partnership between us impossible, regardless of how much respect and cooperation we managed to build. What do you want, Serafina? Cale asked. Genuinely, setting aside the political considerations for a moment, what would bring you happiness? Serafina considered the question for a long moment, and Cale watched something shift in her expression, a kind of quiet honesty, emerging that he had rarely glimpsed during their 2 years of careful, formal partnership. I do not know if I love you, Cale, she said finally. I respect you, and I have found genuine satisfaction in the work of helping to govern this pack, but I do not believe I have ever truly known you, not the way a mate should know their partner. I think, if I am honest, I have spent 2 years wondering if a warmer connection might exist for me elsewhere, with someone who does not carry the weight of an unresolved bond to another woman. The admission surprised Cale, though he found himself grateful for her candor rather than offended by it. Is there someone? He asked gently. A faint blush colored Serafina's cheeks, an uncharacteristic display of vulnerability from a woman who had always maintained careful composure. There is a warrior in my father's pack, Percy Thornhill, who has shown interest in courting me for some time now. I dismissed the possibility, given my marriage to you, but I confess I have thought of him more than I probably should, given the circumstances. Cale felt an unexpected wave of relief wash through him at this revelation, understanding that Serafina's happiness had never truly been dependent on their marriage, that perhaps both of them had been trapped in an arrangement neither of them genuinely wanted, bound together by political necessity rather than authentic connection. Then perhaps, he said carefully, we should discuss how to dissolve this marriage in a way that allows both of us to pursue genuine happiness, while minimizing the political disruption to our respective packs. A formal dissolution would need to be handled carefully, Serafina agreed, her mind already working through the practical implications of such a significant decision. My father invested considerable political capital in this alliance. We would need to find a way to preserve the cooperation between our packs, even as we dissolve the marriage that originally symbolized it. Over the following weeks, Cale and Serafina worked together, with the assistance of trusted advisors from both packs, to craft a careful political resolution that would allow their marriage to be formally dissolved without destabilizing the broader alliance between the Crimson Moon and Drake territories. Alpha Drake, initially resistant to the dissolution of an arrangement he had personally negotiated, eventually came to accept the necessity of the change, particularly once Serafina made clear her own genuine desire to pursue a different path, one that included the possibility of a match with Percy Thornhill that carried the promise of authentic partnership rather than mere political convenience. The formal dissolution ceremony took place quietly, without the public spectacle that had characterized the original rejection of Alara 2 years earlier, a deliberate choice by both Cale and Serafina to handle this transition with dignity and mutual respect rather than public drama. As the ceremony concluded and Serafina prepared to return to her father's territory, she paused to speak with Cale one final time as his wife. I hope you find whatever peace you have been searching for, Cale, she said, her expression warm despite the formal nature of their parting. Whether that peace comes through reconciliation with Lady Voss, or through some other path entirely, you deserve genuine happiness, the same as I do. Thank you, Serafina, Cale said sincerely, for your honesty, your patience, and your understanding throughout this difficult process. I hope Percy Thornhill recognizes the remarkable woman he has the opportunity to court. With Serafina's departure, Cale found himself facing an uncertain future, his marriage dissolved, his pack still processing the complicated revelations of the past weeks, and the woman his wolf had never stopped longing for building an entirely separate life, hundreds of miles to the north, uncertain whether she wished to have anything further to do with him beyond the careful diplomatic relationship established through the summit's peace agreement. He understood that whatever came next would require patience, humility, and a willingness to prove through consistent action, rather than mere words, that he had genuinely changed from the man who had once chosen political convenience over the bond fate had given him. Alara had asked for time, and he intended to honor that request fully, resisting the urge to press for a resolution before she was ready to offer one. But even as he settled into the difficult work of rebuilding his pack's stability in the aftermath of his dissolved marriage, Cale found his thoughts returning constantly to the Northern Haven, to the woman who had transformed her exile into a kingdom, wondering what she was doing in that moment, wondering if she thought of him at all, amid the demands of her own leadership, wondering if the bond that had never truly faded on his end burned with any similar persistence within her. Whatever answer awaited him, he understood that patience, for now, was the only path forward available to him. Word of Cale's dissolved marriage reached the Northern Haven within a month, carried through the trade networks that had developed between the Haven and various pack territories in the aftermath of the summit's peace agreement. Alara received the news from Nathaniel during one of their regular briefings on the Haven's expanding diplomatic relationships, and she found herself absorbing the information with a complicated mixture of emotions she was not entirely prepared to examine. The dissolution was handled quietly, Nathaniel reported, with both parties reportedly reaching the decision mutually. Lady Seraphina has returned to her father's territory, and there are rumors of a potential match with a warrior from the Drake Pack's ranks. Alara nodded, keeping her expression carefully neutral, despite the storm of thoughts the news stirred within her. And the Crimson Moon Pack? How has this affected their political standing? Surprisingly stable, given the circumstances, Nathaniel said. The peace agreement established at the summit appears to be holding regardless of the personal changes within Alpha King Ashbourne's household. If anything, the transparency with which both parties handled the dissolution seems to have earned him a measure of respect among the other pack leaders. Alara considered this information for the remainder of the day, unable to fully focus on the practical matters of governing the Haven that normally occupied her attention without complication. She had told Cale she needed time, and in the weeks since the summit, she had genuinely tried to use that time productively, focusing on the ongoing development of her kingdom, rather than dwelling on the unresolved questions his honesty had raised. But the news of his dissolved marriage forced those questions back to the forefront of her mind with renewed urgency. If Cale was no longer bound by a political marriage, the primary obstacle to any potential reconciliation between them had been removed. The decision now rested entirely on her own willingness to consider a path back toward the man who had once caused her so much pain, regardless of whatever growth or change he had demonstrated since then. It was during this period of internal deliberation that a far more troubling piece of information reached the Northern Haven, delivered by a traveling merchant who had recently passed through the Crimson Moon Pack's territory on his usual trade route. There are whispers within the pack, the merchant told Alara during a private audience, having specifically sought her out due to the sensitive nature of what he had learned. Whispers suggesting that your original rejection 2 years ago was not entirely what it appeared to be. Alara felt a cold, sharp attention settle over her at these words. "Explain," she said, her voice carrying an edge of authority that left no room for evasion. According to several sources within the pack, certain advisors close to Alpha King Ashbourne manipulated the circumstances surrounding your rejection, the merchant explained carefully. There are claims that false information was presented to him regarding supposed disloyalty on your part, information designed specifically to convince him that severing the bond was necessary for the security of the pack. What kind of false information? Alara demanded, her mind racing through the implications of this revelation. The details remain unclear, the merchant admitted, but the rumors suggest you were falsely accused of secretly communicating with a rival pack, information that was fabricated by advisors who saw the alliance with the Drake Pack as more politically advantageous than your continued presence as Luna. It seems these advisors deliberately orchestrated the circumstances that led to your rejection, manipulating the Alpha King into a decision he might not have made if presented with accurate information. Alara sat in stunned silence for a long moment, processing the magnitude of this revelation. If true, it meant that her rejection had not been simply a matter of Cale choosing political convenience over their bond, as she had believed for the past 2 years. It meant she had been deliberately targeted, manipulated out of her position through deceit orchestrated by people within her own former pack. She immediately summoned Nathaniel and Louisa to discuss this troubling new information, both of them equally shocked by the implications. "If this is true," Louisa said, "it changes everything about how we should understand what happened 2 years ago." "We need confirmation," Alara said, her mind already working through the practical steps necessary to verify these claims. I will not act on rumors and second-hand information, regardless of how compelling they might seem. Should we inform Alpha King Ashbourne of what we've learned? Nathaniel asked. Ilara considered this question carefully. Part of her wanted to immediately confront Cale with this information, to understand whether he too had begun uncovering the truth behind the manipulation that had led to her exile. But another part of her, more cautious and wary after everything she had survived, wanted to proceed carefully, verifying the information independently before allowing it to reshape her understanding of the past 2 years. Send word through our trade contacts, she decided finally, discreetly. I want to understand exactly who was involved in this manipulation and why, before we take any action that might alert those responsible to our awareness of their scheme. Over the following weeks, Ilara's network of contacts, built through the trade relationships and diplomatic ties established since the summit, worked quietly to uncover the truth behind the rumors. What they discovered confirmed the merchant's initial report and revealed a far more elaborate scheme than Ilara had initially anticipated. 2 senior advisors within the Crimson Moon Pack, seeking to strengthen their own political influence through the alliance with the powerful Drake territory, had indeed fabricated evidence suggesting Ilara maintained secret, disloyal communications with a rival pack. But they had presented this false evidence to Cale in the days leading up to the rejection ceremony, deliberately timing their manipulation to coincide with ongoing negotiations for the alliance with Seraphina's family, ensuring that Cale would be forced to make a hasty decision, without the opportunity for careful investigation into the veracity of the claims against her. The revelation was staggering. Cale had not simply chosen political convenience over his bond with her, as she had believed for 2 years. He had been deliberately deceived, manipulated into believing she posed a genuine threat to the pack's security, manipulated into a decision that served the personal ambitions of advisors who had exploited his position and his trust for their own political gain. Ilara sat with this information for several days, wrestling with the complicated shift in perspective it demanded. Her anger toward Cale, which had sustained her through 2 years of building an entirely new life, now felt suddenly, uncomfortably misdirected. He had still made the choice to reject her without seeking her side of the story, still failed to trust in the bond they shared, enough to question the evidence presented against her. But the deliberate manipulation orchestrated by his advisors added a layer of complexity to the situation that she could not simply ignore. What will you do with this information? Louisa asked, watching her friend process the difficult revelations. I need to speak with Cale, Ilara said finally, her decision made. He deserves to know the truth about what actually happened, regardless of what it means, for whatever remains unresolved between us. She sent word to the Crimson Moon Pack requesting a private meeting with Cale, framing the request in careful, diplomatic language that gave no indication of the troubling information she had uncovered. Cale responded within days, agreeing to meet at a neutral location, along the border between their respective territories, eager for any opportunity to speak with her again, after weeks of patiently respecting the space she had requested. They met at a small clearing along the border, accompanied by minimal escorts, to ensure the privacy the sensitive conversation required. Cale's expression shifted from cautious hope to genuine alarm as he registered the gravity written across Ilara's features. What's happened? He asked immediately. Has something threatened the haven? No, Ilara said, taking a steadying breath before continuing. But I have learned something about the circumstances of my rejection 2 years ago that I believe you need to know. She proceeded to lay out everything her investigation had uncovered, watching Cale's expression transform from confusion to dawning horror as the implications of the manipulation became clear to him. By the time she finished, his hands had curled into tight fists at his sides, his entire body radiating a controlled fury that she recognized as directed not at her, but at the betrayal of trust he was only now discovering had shaped one of the most significant decisions of his life. Who? He demanded, his voice tight with barely contained anger. Which advisors orchestrated this deception? Ilara provided the names her investigation had confirmed, watching recognition and rage war across Cale's features as he processed the reality that people he had trusted, people who had served on his council for years, had deliberately manipulated him into destroying the bond that mattered most to him, all for the sake of their own political advancement. I need to return to my pack immediately, Cale said, his mind already racing through the implications of this discovery. This betrayal cannot go unaddressed. But Alara, I need you to know that this revelation does not excuse my own failures in that moment. I still chose to act on the evidence presented to me without seeking your perspective, without trusting the bond enough to question what I was being told. The manipulation explains how the deception occurred, but it does not erase my responsibility for the choice I made. Alara studied him for a long moment, appreciating the honesty of his acknowledgement, even amid the shock of this revelation. I appreciate you saying that, she said. But Kale, I think we both need time to process what this means, for both of us individually, and for whatever remains between us. This is not a simple matter that can be resolved in a single conversation. I understand, Kale said, though the urgency in his expression suggested he was already formulating plans to address the betrayal within his own council. But I need you to know, Alara, that whatever happens next, I intend to hold those responsible accountable for what they did, both to you and to the bond that should have been protected rather than deliberately destroyed. As Alara made her way back toward the northern haven that evening, she found herself grappling with a complicated tangle of emotions. The anger she had carried for 2 years, now redirected toward the advisors who had orchestrated her downfall, while a cautious, fragile hope began to take root, regarding the possibility of genuine reconciliation with the man she had once loved with her whole heart. Whatever came next, she understood that the truth, however painful and complicated, represented an essential foundation for whatever future might yet be possible between them. Kale returned to the Crimson Moon Pack with a controlled fury that his advisors immediately sensed the moment he strode into the council chamber, his expression carrying none of the careful diplomatic composure he typically maintained during formal proceedings. He called an emergency session of the full council, insisting that every senior advisor attend without exception, a demand that immediately raised anxious speculation throughout the pack about what had prompted such an urgent summons. 2 years ago, Kale began, once the council had fully assembled, his voice carrying a steely edge that silenced the room instantly. I rejected my fated mate, based on evidence presented to me by members of this very council. Evidence suggesting she maintained disloyal communications with a rival pack. He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the assembled advisors, watching carefully for any flicker of guilt or nervousness that might betray the guilty parties before he named them directly. I have recently learned that this evidence was entirely fabricated, deliberately constructed by individuals within this council, seeking to advance their own political interests through the alliance with the Drake territory. The chamber erupted into a murmur of shocked disbelief, advisors exchanging alarmed glances as they processed this explosive accusation. Kale allowed the reaction to settle before continuing, his eyes finally fixing on 2 specific advisors seated near the back of the chamber, both of whom had gone notably pale at his opening statement. Edric Vane, Percival Hale. Kale's voice rang out clearly, naming the 2 advisors his investigation had identified as the primary architects of the deception. I would ask that you explain to this council exactly what role you played in fabricating evidence against Alara Voss 2 years ago. A tense silence followed, broken finally by Edric Vane, rising slowly from his seat, his expression a careful mask of forced composure that could not fully conceal the fear evident in his eyes. Alpha King, I do not know what information you believe you have obtained, but I assure you. Do not insult me with denials, Kale interrupted, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet register that carried more menace than any shout could have achieved. I have confirmation from multiple independent sources regarding your involvement in this scheme. I would advise you to consider carefully how you wish to proceed, given the severity of the consequences that betraying your Alpha King's trust in this manner will carry. Edric's composure finally cracked under the weight of Kale's certainty, and he sank back into his seat, his silence serving as confirmation more damning than any spoken admission could have provided. Percival Hale, recognizing the futility of continued denial, offered a more direct, if reluctant, acknowledgement. We believe the alliance with the Drake Pack represented the best path forward for the security and prosperity of this territory, Alpha King. Alara Voss, however capable, lacked the political connections necessary to secure the kind of strategic partnerships our pack required. So you decided to manipulate me into destroying my own fated bond, Kale said, his voice carrying a controlled fury that made several advisors in the chamber visibly flinch. You fabricated evidence, deliberately timed to prevent proper investigation, all to serve your own vision of political strategy, regardless of the personal devastation it would cause, regardless of the fact that you were manipulating your own Alpha King into a decision that violated the most sacred bond our kind can experience. The council chamber remained utterly silent, every advisor present understanding the gravity of the situation unfolding before them, aware that the consequences for such a profound betrayal of trust would likely be severe. You are both stripped of your positions on this council, effective immediately, Kale announced, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority as Alpha King. You will be exiled from Crimson Moon territory, and you will carry with you the knowledge that your ambition caused irreparable harm to an innocent woman who deserved far better than the fate your deception forced upon her. The formal proceedings to exile the two advisors continued throughout the remainder of the day, the pack processing the shocking revelation of the betrayal that had shaped one of the most significant decisions in their Alpha King's recent history. By evening, word of the exposed conspiracy had spread throughout the entire territory, generating a wave of sympathy for Alara Voss that had not existed during the original rejection ceremony 2 years earlier, when most pack members had simply accepted the official narrative without question. In the days that followed, Kale found himself facing the difficult work of rebuilding trust within his own council, appointing new advisors to replace those exiled for their betrayal, while also grappling with the personal implications of understanding that his rejection of Alara had been built on a foundation of deliberate lies. The knowledge did not fully absolve him of responsibility, as he had acknowledged to Alara during their meeting at the border, but it did provide a measure of closure regarding the circumstances that had led to such a devastating choice. Meanwhile, tensions along the eastern border, seemingly resolved by the summit's peace agreement, began to resurface as the Thornwood Pack grew increasingly dissatisfied with the practical implementation of the joint stewardship arrangement over the disputed mining territories. Reports reached both the Crimson Moon Pack and the Northern Haven of skirmishes breaking out along the contested boundaries, small conflicts that threatened to escalate into the very war the summit had been convened to prevent. Alara found herself drawn back into the complex political situation when a delegation from the Thornwood Pack arrived at the Northern Haven, seeking her direct intervention as the neutral party responsible for overseeing the joint stewardship arrangement. The other packs are not honoring the agreed-upon extraction percentages, the Thornwood representative explained, his frustration evident. We have documented evidence of the Drake Pack claiming resources beyond their allotted share, and our patience for diplomatic patience is wearing thin. Alara immediately dispatched investigators to verify these claims, understanding that the fragile peace established at the summit could collapse entirely if this dispute was not addressed swiftly and fairly. Her investigation confirmed some validity to the Thornwood Pack's complaints, though it also revealed that the discrepancies stemmed from genuine confusion about measurement standards, rather than deliberate deception on the Drake Pack's part. Resolving this dispute required Alara to coordinate closely with representatives from multiple pack territories, including, inevitably, Kale Ashbourne, whose pack maintained close alliance ties with the Drake territory, and therefore held significant stake in how the resolution unfolded. Their renewed collaboration on this practical political matter provided an unexpected opportunity for Alara and Kale to rebuild a working relationship grounded in mutual respect and shared responsibility, separate from the complicated personal history that remained unresolved between them. Your handling of this dispute has been remarkably fair, Kale observed during one of their coordination meetings, held at the border clearing that had become their customary meeting place for matters requiring direct discussion. Given the history between the Northern Haven and the established packs, many would have expected you to favor the Thornwood Pack's grievances simply to assert the Haven's independence and authority. Fairness is the entire foundation of what I have built, Alara replied simply. If I allow personal or political considerations to compromise that fairness, I lose the very credibility that makes the Northern Haven's neutral stewardship valuable to the wider political landscape. As the weeks passed, and the border dispute was gradually resolved through careful diplomatic negotiation, Alara found her professional interactions with Kale settling into a rhythm of genuine mutual respect, the earlier tension of their unresolved personal history gradually giving way to a working partnership that highlighted the compatibility of their leadership styles and values. She could not deny, even to herself, that spending regular time in his presence witnessing firsthand the genuine reforms he had implemented within his own pack, following the exposure of the advisor's betrayal, was slowly eroding the careful emotional distance she had maintained since the summit. It was during a particularly tense negotiation session, addressing a final flashpoint in the border dispute that threatened to unravel weeks of careful diplomatic progress, that the fragile peace between all the involved parties faced its most serious test. A group of rogue wolves, taking advantage of the confusion and tension along the contested border, launched a coordinated raid against a Thornwood settlement, an attack that the Thornwood pack immediately, and mistakenly, attributed to deliberate Drake pack aggression. Within hours, both packs had mobilized their warriors, preparing for what threatened to become the very open conflict the summit's peace agreement had been designed to prevent. Alara received word of the escalating crisis while meeting with Kale to finalize the last remaining details of the mining territory dispute, and both of them immediately recognized the urgent necessity of intervening before the situation spiraled beyond any possibility of peaceful resolution. "We need to reach the border settlements before either side commits to open combat," Alara said, already calling for her honor guard to prepare for immediate departure. "If we can demonstrate conclusively that rogue wolves, not the Drake pack, were responsible for the raid, we may still be able to prevent this from escalating into full-scale war." "I will ride with you," Kale said immediately, his own warriors already assembling in response to his urgent commands. "The Crimson Moon Pack's alliance with the Drake territory gives me standing to help de-escalate this situation, directly with the Thornwood leadership." Together, Alara and Kale led a combined force toward the contested border settlements, racing against time, to prevent the fragile peace they had both worked so hard to establish from collapsing into exactly the kind of devastating conflict that had originally brought them together at the summit. Whatever remained unresolved between them personally, they understood, in this moment of shared urgency, that their combined strength and standing offered the best possible chance of averting a war that would cost countless lives across multiple pack territories. As they rode through the night toward the border, side by side for the first time in 2 years, in a shared moment of genuine partnership and purpose, Alara found herself acutely aware of how naturally their combined leadership seemed to function, how instinctively they anticipated each other's strategic thinking, how the old bond between them, however damaged by past betrayal, still provided a foundation of trust and understanding that neither time nor pain had fully managed to erase. Whatever awaited them at the border, she understood that this crisis would prove a defining test, not only for the fragile peace across the wolf territories, but for whatever possibility of reconciliation still remained between the Alpha King and the Wolf Queen he had once cast aside. They reached the border settlement just before dawn, arriving to find the Thornwood warriors already assembled at the edge of their territory, facing off against a smaller contingent of Drake Pack representatives who had rushed to the scene to defend against accusations they insisted were entirely unfounded. The air crackled with tension, both sides clearly prepared to escalate into violence at the slightest provocation, years of underlying distrust finally boiling over into what threatened to become an irreversible conflict. Alara dismounted quickly, Kale following close behind, both of them moving with the practiced authority of leaders accustomed to commanding immediate attention in moments of crisis. "Stand down," Alara called out, her voice carrying clearly across the tense standoff, projected with the kind of commanding presence that had become second nature to her after years of leading the Northern Haven through countless challenges. "Before either side commits to actions that cannot be undone, I need everyone here to hear what my investigators have discovered about the true source of last night's attack." The Thornwood Alpha, standing at the front of his assembled warriors, turned toward her with barely contained fury. "Your investigators have had ample opportunity to address the ongoing violations of our agreement. Now our people have been attacked, and you expect us to simply stand down while you investigate further?" "I understand your anger," Alara said, keeping her voice steady despite the volatile atmosphere surrounding them. "But before you commit your warriors to a war that will cost countless lives on both sides, you deserve to know the truth. My investigators tracked the raiding party responsible for last night's attack. They were not Drake Pack warriors. They were rogue wolves, unaffiliated with any established pack, taking advantage of the tension along this border to loot and destroy without facing organized resistance." She gestured to Nathaniel, who stepped forward carrying physical evidence gathered by the Haven's investigators throughout the night. tracks and markings that clearly identified the attackers as rogue wolves rather than trained Drake Pack warriors, along with testimony gathered from surviving witnesses who had glimpsed their attackers clearly enough to confirm they bore none of the Drake Pack's distinctive markings. The Thornwood Alpha studied the evidence carefully, his fury gradually giving way to a more measured consideration, as the physical proof made clear that his people had drawn the wrong conclusion in the chaos and grief following the attack. "If this is true," he said slowly, "then we owe the Drake Pack an apology, and we have nearly started an unnecessary war based on a tragic misunderstanding." Kale stepped forward then, adding his own voice to the effort at de-escalation. "The Crimson Moon Pack stands ready to assist in tracking down the rogue wolves responsible for this attack, ensuring they face justice for the harm they caused your people. This tragedy need not become the spark that ignites a war none of us actually want." The tension that had gripped the border settlement gradually began to ease, as both sides absorbed the reality that they had nearly been manipulated into conflict by the actions of opportunistic rogues, rather than genuine aggression from a supposed ally. Over the following hours, Ilara and Kale worked together, alongside representatives from both the Thornwood and Drake territories, to coordinate a joint effort to track down and neutralize the rogue wolves responsible for the raid, transforming what had nearly become a devastating war into an opportunity for renewed cooperation between the various pack territories. By the time the immediate crisis had been fully resolved, the sun had risen high overhead, and exhaustion had begun to settle over everyone involved in the tense, sleepless night of crisis management. As the various delegations began making preparations to return to their respective territories, Ilara found herself standing alone with Kale, near the edge of the settlement, both of them finally allowing themselves a moment of quiet reflection after the intensity of the preceding hours. "We make a good team," Kale observed quietly, watching as the last of the Thornwood and Drake representatives departed on friendly terms, the crisis fully diffused through their combined efforts. "I had forgotten how naturally our instincts seem to align, even after everything that has happened between us." Ilara considered his words carefully, aware that the events of the past day had stripped away much of the careful emotional distance she had maintained since the summit. Working alongside Kale through this genuine crisis, witnessing firsthand his commitment to justice and peaceful resolution, rather than easy political convenience, had revealed a man who had indeed grown and changed in meaningful ways since the devastating night of her rejection 2 years ago. "We do," she admitted finally, allowing herself a rare moment of genuine vulnerability. "I have spent 2 years telling myself that I built the Northern Haven to prove I did not need you, that I could thrive independent of any bond or partnership, and that remains true, Kale. I do not need you to feel complete or capable." "But," Kale asked gently, sensing there was more she wished to say. "But needing someone and choosing to build a life alongside them are not the same thing," Ilara continued, her voice carrying a thoughtful honesty that reflected the genuine growth of her own perspective over the difficult months since the summit. "I have watched you take responsibility for what happened, hold those who manipulated you accountable, and demonstrate through consistent action rather than empty words that you have genuinely changed. I cannot simply forget the pain of what happened 2 years ago. But I find myself less interested in punishing you for it, and more curious about what an honest partnership between us, built as equals rather than as ruler and subject, might actually look like." Kale felt something shift powerfully in his chest at her words, a cautious hope beginning to bloom after months of patient waiting and uncertain longing. "What would that partnership look like, in your mind?" he asked carefully, unwilling to presume too much from her tentative openness. "I will not abandon the Northern Haven," Ilara said firmly. "The people there depend on my leadership, and I have built something there that I am not willing to simply set aside, regardless of whatever happens between us personally. If there is to be any future between us, it must accommodate the reality of what I have built, not require me to return to being simply your Luna, subordinate to your throne." "I would never ask that of you," Kale said immediately. "I have watched you lead an entire kingdom, with more wisdom and fairness than I have managed even with the advantages of an established territory and generations of accumulated resources. Whatever future exists between us, Ilara, it must be built as a partnership between equals, 2 rulers, choosing to combine their strength, rather than one absorbing the other." "A union of equals," Ilara said slowly, testing the phrase, finding something genuinely appealing in the concept, after years of watching traditional pack hierarchies fail to protect the vulnerable and reward only rigid bloodlines and political convenience. The Northern Haven and the Crimson Moon Pack allied not through subordination, but through genuine mutual respect and shared purpose. "I would be honored to build such a partnership with you," Cale said, his voice carrying a sincerity that resonated through the renewed bond stirring between them, no longer suppressed by years of denial and separation. "Not because our fated bond demands it, though I will not pretend that bond has ever truly faded despite everything that happened, but because I have watched you become someone I admire, beyond anything I could have imagined 2 years ago, and I would be honored to spend whatever years remain to us, building something meaningful alongside you." Ilara studied him for a long moment, weighing the weight of this moment against everything she had survived and built in the years since her rejection. The pain of that night in the Great Hall would never fully disappear, she understood. Some wounds left permanent marks, regardless of how thoroughly healing eventually occurred around them. But she had also learned, through the difficult journey of the past 2 years, that strength did not require the absence of vulnerability, that choosing to open herself to genuine partnership again did not diminish the formidable queen she had become. "I am not ready to promise anything permanent," she said finally, honesty guiding her words, even as hope began to color her tone. "But I am willing to explore what a genuine partnership between us might look like, built slowly, with patience, and with full respect for everything both of us have become since that night 2 years ago." "That is more than I ever believed I deserved to hope for," Cale said, relief and joy mingling openly across his features, for the first time since their reunion at the summit months earlier. Over the following months, Ilara and Cale began the careful work of rebuilding trust between them, meeting regularly to coordinate the growing alliance between their respective territories, while also allowing their personal relationship to develop at a pace that honored the complicated history between them. Cale made frequent visits to the Northern Haven, witnessing firsthand the remarkable community Ilara had built from nothing, growing to genuinely respect the systems of fairness and mutual support that governed her kingdom. Systems that differed significantly from the more rigid hierarchies that had traditionally characterized the established pack territories. In turn, Ilara began spending time within the Crimson Moon Pack's territory, observing the genuine reforms Cale had implemented since exposing the advisors who had betrayed his trust, watching him rebuild his council with individuals chosen for their integrity and commitment to fair leadership rather than political ambition alone. She found herself gradually rediscovering the qualities that had originally drawn her to him, 3 years ago now, before the devastating rejection that had reshaped both of their lives so profoundly. Louisa, watching her friend's careful, gradual reconciliation with the Alpha King, offered her honest observations during one of their regular conversations. "You seem different lately," she noted. "Lighter somehow, despite everything the Haven continues to demand of your attention." "I am learning that healing does not require permanent isolation from the source of my original wound," Ilara said thoughtfully, understanding this truth more deeply with each passing month of careful, patient reconciliation. "Cale hurt me terribly 2 years ago, but he has also demonstrated, through sustained effort rather than empty apology, that people can genuinely change, that mistakes, however devastating, do not have to define the entire trajectory of someone's character." Nearly a year after the fateful summit that had brought them back into each other's lives, Ilara and Cale formally announced their intention to reunite as mates, though the ceremony they eventually held bore little resemblance to the traditional rituals that had once governed such unions within the established pack hierarchies. Rather than Ilara simply becoming Luna to Cale's Alpha King, the ceremony recognized both of them as equal rulers, their territories formally allied through partnership rather than subordination. A union that honored the individual strength and sovereignty each of them had fought so hard to establish. The ceremony took place at the neutral grounds near the Silver Pine border, the same location where the summit had first brought them back into contact after 2 years of separation. A deliberate choice that acknowledged the full journey their reconciliation had required. Representatives from every major pack territory attended, including a radiant Seraphina, now formally courting Percy Thornhill, offering her genuine well-wishes to the couple whose complicated history had ultimately led all 3 of them toward more authentic happiness than the original political arrangement could have ever provided. As Alara stood beside Kale during the ceremony, feeling the renewed bond between them settle into something stronger and more resilient than it had ever been before their painful separation, she found herself reflecting on the remarkable journey that had brought her to this moment. The broken, rejected girl who had walked away from the Crimson Moon Pack 2 years ago, carrying nothing but a knife, a cloak, and a shattered heart, had transformed into a queen who commanded genuine respect across the entire Wolf Kingdom. A queen who had ultimately chosen reconciliation, not from weakness or desperation, but from a place of hard-won strength and clear-eyed wisdom. "I once told you," she said quietly to Kale, as the formal ceremony concluded and the gathered crowd began their celebration, "that a king who breaks his own bond to serve his throne will one day find that the throne cannot love him back." "You did," Kale acknowledged, remembering her words from that devastating night with perfect clarity. "And you were right to say it." "I believe now," Alara continued, a genuine smile finally breaking through her carefully composed expression, "that the throne alone was never meant to be enough for either of us. But perhaps, together, ruling as equals rather than as isolated monarchs each carrying our burdens alone, we might finally discover what it truly means to build something worth ruling." As the celebration continued around them, marking not only their reunion but the broader peace and cooperation that had gradually emerged across the Wolf territories in the aftermath of the summit's initial peace agreement, Alara allowed herself, for the first time in years, to simply exist in a moment of genuine contentment, free from the weight of old grief or the anxiety of political calculation. The Wolf Queen and the Alpha King had found their way back to each other, not through the simple restoration of what had been broken, but through the harder, more meaningful work of building something entirely new, forged in the fires of betrayal, transformed through genuine growth, and ultimately strengthened by the hard-won wisdom that only true partnership between equals could provide. Whatever challenges awaited them in the years ahead, they would face them together, as they were always meant to. From the very first moment, fate had bound them beneath the light of the same watchful moon,